This story is based on true events. The names of characters and cities have been changed for confidentiality purposes. In the heart of New York City, nestled among the towering buildings that stretched toward the sky like the jagged teeth of a monstrous beast, there sat a small, unremarkable daycare center. From the outside, it was a place of warmth and color, a painted sign hanging crookedly from the front, featuring a smiling sun and cartoon animals, promising safety, care, and laughter for the city's youngest residents. Inside, the daycare center was a cacophony of noise and movement, the sounds of children's laughter echoing off the walls, punctuated by the occasional shriek of a toy being snatched from tiny hands or a quiet sob as another child cried out for their parent. It was a world of innocence, a place where toddlers took their first steps, where they learned to share, to talk, to play. And yet, it was a world also tinged with darkness, a darkness that had yet to reveal itself, hidden beneath the bright colors and the cheerful atmosphere. In one corner of the room sat a girl, small and quiet, her face a mask of concentration as she carefully placed one block atop another. She was no different from the others in appearance, no more or less special than the other children, all of whom had their own personalities, quirks, and fleeting moments of joy. But Lily, the 3-year-old at the center of it all, was different in a way no one could immediately see. She had the same big brown eyes as the other children, the same dark hair pulled back into a messy ponytail. She wore the same pastel-colored dress, adorned with cartoon characters, as the other little girls. She smiled at times, and she laughed, though her laughter always seemed quieter, more distant than the others. She often seemed to be lost in her own world, sitting by herself, while the other children formed groups, played tag, or gathered around the teacher for story time. She was never rude, never mean. But there was an air about her, a kind of stillness that unsettled those who paid attention. Lily was known to the daycare staff as a shy, introverted child. Her behavior was not necessarily concerning at first glance. After all, many children that age were prone to retreat into themselves, especially in such a busy environment filled with so much stimulation. But there was something about the way Lily watched the other children, the way her eyes would follow them, unblinking, as if she were studying them, calculating their every move. There was something chilling in the way she didn't respond to the usual cues of happiness or frustration, instead choosing to observe in silence. No one, not even the teachers, could explain it. She was often by herself, retreating to the corner of the room or sitting near the large window where the city's traffic could be seen moving endlessly outside. She was always looking out, her gaze distant, as if she were waiting for something that the others could not perceive. Her parents were good people, well-meaning and kind, though often busy with their lives in the city. They had enrolled Lily in the daycare, hoping that it would be a place for her to socialize, to make friends, to learn to be a part of something larger than herself. They worried about her aloofness, but they chalked it up to shyness, as many parents did. They thought that, like so many other children, she would grow out of it, would one day come to embrace the joy of childhood the way so many other children did. They couldn't know, nor could anyone, that there was something beneath the surface, something waiting to break free. It was a cold morning in early spring when the first whispers of something terrible began to take form. The daycare center, a bustling place of noise and chaos, seemed to hold its breath as the children played, and the teachers tried their best to manage the groups of energetic toddlers. There was no particular event that marked the change, no sudden sign that anything was wrong. In fact, that day had started like any other. The children arrived one by one, their backpacks slung over their shoulders, some crying as they were dropped off by their parents, others eager to begin their day of play. It was a place of routine, where everything happened as it always did, with only the smallest shifts in atmosphere as the day went on. Lily, as usual, had arrived early. Her parents, both busy with work, had dropped her off before most of the other children had even arrived. She was already sitting in her usual spot, quietly drawing with crayons as the sunlight filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor. She didn't mind the solitude. In fact, she preferred it. She watched as the other children arrived, gathering in groups as they always did, but she didn't join them. Instead, she focused on her drawing, her small hands moving with surprising dexterity for one so young. The picture she was creating was simple enough, a drawing of a tree with birds in the branches, but as she worked, her movements grew more hurried, more frantic, as if she were trying to get something out before it slipped away. The colors she used were dark, the greens of the tree too deep, the sky too gray. There was something almost unnatural about it, but no one noticed. The day began to unfold, the usual pattern of playtime, snacks and games continuing without incident. Lily had become more withdrawn as the morning passed, her eyes darting between the other children, her hands now holding the crayons so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The room was filled with the usual noises, the laughter, the shouts of children playing, the faint hum of music from the speakers overhead, but Lily was no longer paying attention. She was watching something else, something that the others couldn't see. There was a moment when the teacher, Ms. Thompson, noticed Lily's behavior, her unblinking stare, her tense posture, but before she could approach, the moment was gone. The noise of the other children took over, and Lily disappeared into the background once again. No one saw what was coming, not the teachers, not the other children, not even Lily herself. And yet the signs were there, subtle, quiet, barely noticeable. The way her fingers clenched around the crayon, the way her gaze followed the other children as they played, the way she never quite seemed to fit in. It was as if Lily was a passenger in a world she didn't fully understand, a world that would soon betray her innocence. What followed would be a tragedy that no one could have anticipated, the events set into motion by a series of seemingly inconsequential moments that would spiral into something far darker. It was as if the daycare itself, with its colorful walls and its playful design, was a stage upon which a sinister play was about to unfold, a play in which the protagonist was a 3-year-old girl, unaware of the destruction she was about to unleash, but inexorably drawn toward it. And in the days that followed, the daycare would never be the same. Neither would Lily, nor would anyone who had witnessed the horror of that spring morning. The daycare center was a brightly colored world of primary hues, designed to envelop children in a sense of safety and joy. The walls were lined with soft murals of smiling animals and rainbow arches, the floors covered with a plush carpet that absorbed the constant energy of toddlers rushing from one activity to the next. Each corner of the space was filled with toys, blocks, dolls, cars, things that invited play and exploration. It was a world that seemed to promise nothing but innocence, a world where every child should have felt protected and cherished. But as the morning light crept through the large windows, spilling golden streaks across the room, something else began to stir in the shadows. The quiet corners where children hid from the chaos were not just places of solitude, but places where thoughts festered, growing dark and unfamiliar. Lily had been playing alone, as usual, in her little corner of the room. She sat on a small chair, hunched over her drawing, her crayons scattered around her like the tools of some secret craft. Her tiny fingers held the crayons with surprising precision as she worked feverishly. The picture she was drawing was not like the others. It wasn't the usual bright flowers or sunshiny skies. This was different, darker. She drew a tree, but the tree had twisted, contorted branches that seemed to reach out, almost clawing at the page. The leaves were a dull, unnatural green, and in the sky above it, there were ominous clouds, gray and swirling. The birds she had drawn were strange too. Their wings were jagged, and their eyes looked too knowing, as though they saw something that others could not. Her fingers shook slightly as she colored in the branches. She paused often, her eyes never leaving the paper, as if each movement was deliberate, each stroke a part of something much larger, something she didn't fully understand. Her drawing was not an act of simple childhood expression, it was an act of creation, but also destruction. She didn't know it, of course. She was only 3 years old, and in her world, drawing was supposed to be fun, a means of expressing her imagination. But today the line between innocence and darkness seemed to blur. As Lily worked, the rest of the children began to gather in the central area of the room. The noise picked up a blur of shouting, laughter, and the clatter of toys being tossed around. Some of the children ran in circles, others formed groups and started building towers with blocks, their little hands stacking the colorful cubes higher and higher. There was a rhythm to it all, a natural flow that the adults in the room had become so accustomed to. They didn't notice the changes. No one saw how the chaos of play was starting to shift into something more intense. The day was just beginning to unfold in its usual way. And then, the first loud shout rang out across the room, jarring everyone's attention. The source of the disturbance was a small group of children who had gathered around the large plastic blocks. They were building a structure together, a little fortress of sorts, but an argument quickly broke out over who would get the red block. A small, round block that had no special significance, except for the fact that it was the most coveted piece of the set. It was a silly thing. Really, children fighting over a toy. Something that would seem so insignificant to an adult, but to the children, in that moment, it was a matter of pride, of control. As the argument escalated, so did the volume in the room. Voices overlapped in a cacophony of frustration, the clamor of tiny fists hitting the floor, the sound of bodies shifting restlessly as the children jostled for the red block. The commotion grew louder, more frantic. The teachers, who had been monitoring the room, attempted to intervene, but their words were swallowed by the rising noise. Ms. Thompson, the lead teacher, was the closest to the scene, but she was momentarily distracted, her attention drawn toward another child who had been crying quietly in the corner. It was just a few moments, mere seconds, but those seconds would prove to be enough. Lily had stopped coloring when the argument began. She hadn't joined in with the others. Instead, she stood frozen, watching the group. Her wide brown eyes never left the scene, her gaze fixed as though she were studying the conflict with an intense, almost predatory interest. She could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the tension that hung in the air like a storm about to break. Something about the chaos unsettled her. She had never liked loud noises, never liked the way people shouted at each other. She wanted things to be quiet again, the way they had been before the shouting started. The blocks were scattered on the floor, some knocked aside, others piled haphazardly on top of each other. One child, whose name was Thomas, grabbed at the red block, his face flushed with determination. His small fingers gripped the block so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Another child, Sarah, tugged at the other end, pulling back as though her life depended on it. Her tiny feet dug into the floor as she yanked the block with all her strength, her face scrunched in frustration. In that moment, the situation reached a boiling point. The other children, sensing the rising conflict, began to crowd around, shouting and pushing to get a better view, or perhaps to take part in the struggle. Lily, still standing at the edge of the chaos, felt a strange pull. It was like an instinctive response, a feeling that she had to do something, though she didn't know what. She had watched the other children argue, and for some reason she felt a need to intervene. Maybe she could stop them from fighting. Maybe she could make them all stop shouting. Her small hands gripped the chair she had been sitting in, and she pushed herself up to her feet. Her gaze was still locked on the group of children, but now she took a step forward. The room seemed to stretch out in front of her as she slowly made her way across the floor. Each movement felt deliberate, each step purposeful, as if she were carrying out some preordained task. She was no longer just a quiet observer, she was becoming part of the chaos. As she neared the pile of blocks, she saw the way the children were struggling, the way the blocks had shifted, toppling over one another. She wasn't strong enough to stop them from fighting, but there was something she could do. Her tiny hands reached for the nearest block, one of the larger ones, a heavy plastic piece. She didn't understand the danger of what she was doing. She didn't understand the weight of it, the power that the block could have in this moment. But she reached for it anyway, and as her fingers made contact, the world seemed to freeze. She pulled the block toward her, not knowing that her motion would set off a chain reaction. The block was heavier than she expected. As she moved it, her hand slipped, and the block tumbled, hitting the edge of a shelf that had been precariously stacked with more blocks. The force of the impact caused the entire shelf to shift. In that split second, time seemed to slow. The sound of the blocks shifting and crashing echoed in the room, a deafening noise that rattled through the walls. The shelf tipped over, sending a cascade of blocks tumbling to the floor in a terrible, thunderous crash. The children near the blocks were knocked off their feet as the heavy plastic blocks rained down on them. Some screamed, others were silent, but the sound of the collapse was like a curse, reverberating in every corner of the daycare. Lily stood frozen in place, her eyes wide, her body stiff with shock. The blocks had fallen, and the children had been caught in the mess. Some were trapped beneath the falling blocks, their tiny bodies pinned under the weight. Others scrambled, crying out in fear and pain. The noise was overwhelming, screams, cries, shouts of panic, but Lily couldn't move. She just stood there, watching as the chaos unfolded, the room filling with the sound of panicked children and the weight of what she had just triggered. The daycare workers rushed in from every direction, attempting to free the children, to pull them from under the fallen blocks. Ms. Thompson, her face pale with fear, was the first to reach the children who were trapped. She screamed for help, but the words were drowned in the cacophony of fear and confusion. The room was filled with the frantic energy of adults trying to make sense of what had just happened, of trying to save the children who were caught. But in the midst of it all, Lily stood there, motionless, her wide eyes filled with a mix of confusion and terror. She didn't understand. She couldn't understand. All she knew was that something had gone terribly wrong. The room had shifted, the world had broken apart, and Lily, with her small hands and her innocent mind, had set it all in motion. The tragedy had begun, and there was no turning back. The room was a blur of motion and noise as the immediate aftermath of the incident unfolded. The once cheerful space, filled with the innocent sounds of childhood play, had become something darker, something that felt foreign. The air was thick with confusion and terror, a sense of dread that settled in the corners, making the walls feel closer, more suffocating. It all happened so fast. The bright, playful daycare room, where colors once bounced off the walls, now seemed cold, foreboding, as if the life had been sucked out of it in an instant. Lily stood in the center of the chaos, frozen in place. Her small figure was dwarfed by the swirling storm around her, adults rushing, children crying, voices shouting in panic. Her wide brown eyes were locked on the scene before her, but there was no comprehension in them, no understanding of what she had just triggered. Her hands, still clutching the large block that had started it all, were shaking, the edges of her fingers turning white as her grip tightened. She hadn't meant for it to happen. She hadn't meant for any of this. But as she stood there, unmoving, her gaze never leaving the pile of fallen blocks and the children trapped beneath them, she began to realize that something irrevocable had occurred, something that could never be undone. The sound of crying pierced through the air. High-pitched, frantic sobs that seemed to echo off the walls, a chorus of fear and pain. The younger children were shrieking in panic, some of them clinging to each other, some of them trying to crawl away from the pile of debris, as though escaping the disaster that had just struck. Their faces were twisted in confusion, tears streaming down their cheeks as they looked for someone to help, someone to make the world make sense again. But there was no one to explain what had just happened. No one could make sense of it. The daycare workers moved swiftly, but with an air of frantic helplessness. Ms. Thompson, the lead teacher, was the first to approach the children who were trapped beneath the blocks. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear, and she moved with a strange urgency, as though trying to outrun the terror that had overtaken the room. She shouted for help, her voice cracking under the weight of the situation, but her cries were drowned by the overwhelming noise. The other teachers, Mrs. Edwards, who had been on the other side of the room, and Mr. Collins, who was near the door, rushed toward her. But there was no clear plan, no clear way to handle the unfolding disaster. It was as if they were all caught in a nightmare, one that was spiraling out of control and offering no way out. As Ms. Thompson reached the children who had been knocked to the ground, her hands shook violently as she tried to lift the blocks, her mind racing but her body moving slowly, as though in disbelief. The weight of the fallen blocks was heavier than she had expected, and she could feel the tension in her muscles as she struggled to clear the debris. But no matter how hard she tried, the blocks didn't budge. Some children were still caught underneath, their cries muffled by the weight of the toys pressing down on them. She could hear the faint whimpers of a few of the children, but it was impossible to tell who was trapped or where they were buried beneath the mess. In the midst of the panic, Lily's gaze remained fixed on the chaos, her small form immobile in the center of it all. Her body felt strangely distant, as though she was not fully part of the scene, as though she were watching it from a place far removed. Her mind was trying to make sense of the situation, but it couldn't. It couldn't process the terror, the screaming, the desperation that was all around her. What had she done? What had she caused? Her breath quickened as the realization began to seep into her consciousness. She hadn't meant for it to happen. She hadn't wanted to hurt anyone. She had simply reached for the block, simply tried to move something in the way. But the way the blocks had fallen, the way the shelf had tipped, it had been too much. The children, her classmates, had been caught beneath the weight of it, helpless, trapped. And it was because of her. Her small hands, her innocent gesture, had caused this. She couldn't shake the feeling that the entire room had shifted somehow, that the world had tilted off its axis, and it was all because of her. The teachers continued to struggle, trying to lift the blocks, trying to free the children, but it felt as if every effort they made only made things worse. More blocks fell. More children screamed. The room, once a sanctuary of warmth and light, now felt like a tomb, filled with the sounds of panic and fear. Ms. Thompson's face was streaked with tears, her lips trembling as she shouted for help, but there was no one who could save them. The chaos seemed to spiral out of control, every second that passed making the situation worse. Every second, the weight of the moment seemed to deepen, like an invisible force pressing down on the room, on the children, on everyone in it. Lily's legs finally gave way, and she collapsed to the floor, her tiny body crumpling in on itself as her mind struggled to process the reality of the situation. She was drowning in a sea of confusion, guilt, and fear. She couldn't look away from the scene in front of her, the children trapped beneath the debris, the teachers desperately trying to free them, the utter helplessness that hung in the air. She wanted to run, wanted to hide from the truth, but she couldn't. She was part of this now. She had caused this. The teachers worked as quickly as they could, but it wasn't fast enough. The daycare center had been a place of joy, of play, of laughter. But now it was something else. The walls seemed to close in on them, the space that had once felt so safe now suffocating. The noise of the children's cries filled the room, and it was almost too much to bear. But still, the teachers pushed forward, trying to pull the blocks from the children's bodies, trying to assess who had been hurt, who was still breathing, who was still alive. In the midst of it all, Lily remained motionless. Her eyes were wide, but there was no longer any curiosity in them, no longer any innocence. They were haunted, filled with an understanding that she had never had before. She had been so small, so innocent, and yet here she was, the cause of this nightmare. It was impossible to escape the weight of that realization. It pressed down on her chest, on her heart, and there was no way to escape it. The room had become a place of shadows, of terror, and Lily felt like she was sinking into them, unable to reach the surface. Ms. Thompson finally managed to free one of the children from under the pile of blocks, but there was no relief in her face. The child, a little boy named Ethan, had been knocked unconscious. His skin was pale, his body limp, his breathing shallow. Ms. Thompson cried out for help, her voice a broken whisper, and the other teachers rushed to assist her. But there was no comfort in the sound of footsteps rushing toward them. There was no safety in the hands that reached for Ethan's body. Lily couldn't look away. She didn't want to look. She didn't want to see the damage, the way the children had been hurt because of her. But there was no turning back. The moment had passed. The reality of it was settling in like a dark cloud, and there was no way to escape it. In the days that followed, the daycare center would be filled with questions and investigations. But for now, in the immediate aftermath, there was nothing but chaos and realization. The world outside had continued on. The city outside the daycare window had not stopped. And yet, here in this room, time had frozen. The innocence of childhood, the trust of parents had been shattered, replaced with something else, something darker and far more unsettling. And in the center of it all, Lily, the small 3-year-old girl, sat motionless, her eyes wide with terror, trapped in her own understanding of what had just happened. The sirens arrived shortly after the paramedics. The shrill wail of emergency vehicles echoed through the empty streets, cutting through the crisp morning air, their flashing lights painting the windows of the daycare in garish reds and blues. Inside, the chaos had reached an unbearable crescendo, with teachers attempting to control the unfolding disaster and parents frantically arriving to claim their children, only to be turned away by the overwhelming scene of crisis. In the center of it all, Lily sat in stunned silence, her small hands clenched tight in her lap, her eyes wide but vacant. She had not moved since the moment of the incident, as if frozen in place by the magnitude of what had happened, too young to fully understand, but too aware to look away. The investigation began almost immediately, though it would take some time before the true horror of the situation fully emerged. In the sterile, cold rooms of the hospital, paramedics worked tirelessly to revive the children who had been trapped beneath the pile of blocks. Some were unconscious, others barely breathing. The doctors and nurses who had arrived at the scene were no strangers to trauma, but nothing could have prepared them for the sight before them: the mangled bodies of children, bruised and battered, their limbs twisted in unnatural ways, their faces pale with fear or shock. Some were lucky. Others were not. The weight of the falling blocks had been too much for some, and by the time the paramedics had arrived, the extent of the damage had become painfully clear. In the days that followed, the daycare was transformed into a center of inquiry, the air thick with uncertainty and dread. Police officers, detectives, and child welfare experts arrived to sift through the wreckage of what had once been a safe, happy place for children. The daycare's employees were questioned one by one, their faces drawn and weary, their voices cracking with emotion as they explained the events leading up to the tragedy. The staff spoke of the children's usual playtime, the chaos of the argument over the red block, and the brief moments of confusion when Lily had moved toward the blocks. But there were no answers, no clarity as to how everything had spiraled so quickly out of control. Everything seemed like a blur, a flash of motion that, in hindsight, made no sense. How had something so simple, so innocent, led to such devastating consequences? Lily's parents were contacted immediately. Her mother arrived first, her face a mask of terror as she was ushered through the sterile halls of the daycare. She had been at work when the call came, her hands trembling as she clutched the phone to her ear, unable to comprehend the words the teacher on the other end was saying. Lily was okay, they assured her, but there had been an accident, a tragic accident. But as soon as she arrived, it became clear that the horror was far worse than anyone could have anticipated. Lily's father, a stoic man who had been working late the night before, arrived shortly after. His face was a blank slate, his expression unreadable. but there was something in the way his shoulders slumped that made it evident that his world had been irreparably shattered. He knew, even before he stepped inside the building, that things would never be the same. As a father, he felt responsible for his daughter's well-being. And yet, in this moment, there was nothing he could have done to protect her from the storm that had descended upon them all. The daycare center was closed for the rest of the week, the building empty of children and teachers. The walls, once vibrant with the laughter of young voices, now stood silent, echoing only the harsh reality of the tragedy. Investigators combed through the scene, their eyes scanning the wreckage for clues, looking for anything that could explain how the fall of a few plastic blocks could cause such devastation. The more they searched, the more questions arose. There were inconsistencies in the reports, small details that didn't add up. The structure had been sturdy, solid, and the blocks themselves, though heavy, were not capable of producing such a catastrophic outcome without an external force. The timing, too, seemed off. According to the teacher's testimony, Lily had simply reached for the block, her hand slipping, and that was when the whole thing fell apart. But could it really have been that simple? As the investigation deepened, the focus inevitably shifted toward Lily herself. How could a child so young have caused so much destruction? There was no malice in her eyes when she had approached the blocks. No anger, no intention to harm. She had been a passive participant in the chaos, not an instigator. And yet, the outcome had been undeniable. 5 children were dead, and Lily was somehow at the center of it all. But in order to understand what had truly happened, the investigators had to dig deeper into Lily's past, into her psyche. A team of child psychologists was called in to evaluate Lily's mental state. They interviewed her over the course of several weeks, trying to piece together the events leading up to the incident. It was clear that Lily had been struggling with something long before the blocks had fallen. She was a quiet child, introverted, with a tendency to retreat into herself. Teachers had noticed her isolation, her preference for solitary play, but nothing that suggested any underlying issues. She had always been compliant, obedient, and well-mannered. But something about her behavior, her drawings, her interactions with the other children, something about her seemed off. The psychologists, after several sessions, began to uncover disturbing patterns. Lily had been fixated on certain objects, certain actions. She had been drawing strange pictures in the weeks leading up to the incident, pictures of twisted trees, jagged birds, and dark skies. Her drawings had been unlike anything the other children had produced. There was an unsettling quality to them, a darkness that no one had taken seriously. But in hindsight, they saw it clearly. The images reflected something deep inside Lily. A yearning for control, an expression of something dark and unexplained. They wondered if Lily had felt some kind of overwhelming pressure, a need to make sense of the chaos in her life, by asserting dominance over it in whatever way she could. The falling blocks had not been an accident. The psychologists concluded that, while Lily had not intentionally set out to harm anyone, she had unknowingly manipulated the environment to create a sense of order, one that in her confused mind had seemed like the only way to restore balance. But the real truth lay in the twisted, unseen dynamics of the daycare itself. The investigation revealed that there had been a hidden tension within the walls of the center. Teachers, though well-meaning, were overwhelmed and stretched thin, often unable to give each child the attention they needed. The children, too, were feeling the strain of an increasingly chaotic and unpredictable environment. The daycare had been underfunded, its resources limited, and the staff had struggled to maintain control over the growing number of children. In that environment, Lily's behavior had been overlooked, her isolation and her odd drawings dismissed as harmless eccentricities. But in reality, it was a cry for help, a sign that something was wrong, something that no one had seen until it was too late. As the weeks passed and the investigation continued, the story of what had truly happened began to unfold. It wasn't just the accident that had caused the deaths of 5 children, it was a perfect storm of negligence, misunderstanding, and unresolved emotional turmoil. Lily had been a victim of circumstance, caught in an environment that had been ill-prepared for the needs of its children. The tragedy had not been the result of malicious intent, but of a broken system, one that had failed to provide the care and attention that children like Lily needed. But in the end, the truth was bittersweet. Lily had unknowingly become the scapegoat, the figure at the center of the storm, even though she had been just another child lost in a world that didn't understand her. The daycare center was shut down, its license revoked, and the staff were placed under investigation for their role in the tragedy. The parents of the children who had died filed lawsuits, seeking justice for their lost ones, but it was clear that no amount of legal retribution could bring their children back. The damage had been done, the lives shattered, and the questions remained unanswered. As for Lily, she was sent to live with her parents, who, despite the overwhelming weight of the tragedy, still clung to the hope that their daughter would recover, that she would somehow make sense of what had happened. But deep down, they knew that nothing would ever be the same. The horror that had unfolded in that daycare, the lives lost, the innocence stolen, none of it could ever be erased. And Lily, though she may never fully understand the consequences of her actions, would carry the burden of that day with her for the rest of her life. The legal and emotional consequences of the daycare tragedy would shape Lily's life in ways that no one could have anticipated. For a 3-year-old, the world she had once known, a world of crayons, playground games, and nap time, had been abruptly torn away, replaced by the cold, impersonal machinery of law and consequence. There was no room for innocence now, no space for the carefree joy that had once filled her days. What had happened to the children in the daycare was not just a tragedy, it was a scandal, an event that sent shockwaves through the community and sparked debates that would ripple through the legal and emotional fabric of Lily's life for years to come. The immediate legal consequences were swift. News of the accident had spread like wildfire, and soon the daycare center was at the center of a media storm. The headlines screamed of horror, of tragedy, of the inexplicable collapse of a seemingly innocent child's playtime into something far darker. Lily's face, pale and wide-eyed, had been captured on the day of the incident and splashed across newspapers, her image linked inexorably with the 5 dead children and the devastation that had been unleashed. She had become a symbol of a tragedy too vast for a child to comprehend, yet the weight of it was thrust upon her nonetheless. As the legal system began to probe deeper into the incident, they realized that the situation was far more complicated than it had appeared at first. On one hand, there was no clear evidence of intent on Lily's part. She was too young, too innocent, to have caused the deaths of 5 children intentionally. But the law, driven by a need to find blame and responsibility, sought to uncover the underlying causes that led to such an unimaginable event. How could a simple playtime accident have spiraled out of control in such a deadly way? Who was ultimately responsible? And if Lily wasn't to blame, who or what was? The daycare center itself faced a barrage of lawsuits. The parents of the deceased children demanded justice, and in a country where legal battles often became public spectacles, the courtroom drama unfolded before an eager audience of reporters and citizens who were desperate for answers. The daycare was quickly sued for negligence, with accusations that the facility had failed to provide a safe environment for the children. But the tragedy was more than just a legal case. It was a question of human error, of systemic failure, and the aftermath left questions that no one could easily answer. As investigations continued, the daycare center was forced to close, and its staff, already devastated by the events, were placed under intense scrutiny. The lead teacher, Ms. Thompson, faced charges of negligence for failing to properly supervise the children, and her mental state began to unravel under the pressure of the blame placed on her. She had always been a dedicated teacher, but the burden of the tragedy was too much for her to bear. Mrs. Edwards and Mr. Collins, the other teachers on duty that day, were also investigated, their professional futures uncertain, as the courts examined their role in the events. The daycare's owners, who had been aware of the underfunded conditions and lack of proper safety protocols, found themselves embroiled in legal battles of their own. The daycare center had been struggling for years, and this failure was a reflection of the cracks in the system that had gone unnoticed by those who had been responsible for the children's care. But for Lily, the legal consequences were more subtle, yet no less devastating. She was too young to face criminal charges, but that didn't spare her from the weight of what had happened. In the months following the incident, she was subjected to numerous psychological evaluations, her every move scrutinized by professionals eager to determine the cause of her actions. Child psychologists, forensic experts, and social workers were brought in to assess Lily's mental state, to figure out whether there was something in her history, her behavior, or her psyche that could explain why the fall of the blocks had become so lethal. They were looking for patterns, looking for something they could blame, and Lily, with her quiet demeanor and withdrawn nature, became a target for their probing. The investigators and therapists who examined Lily seemed more interested in finding a reason for the deaths than understanding the child in front of them. Her quietness, her withdrawn personality, became something to be feared, as though her very nature held the key to the tragedy. They spoke in terms of behavior, of trauma, of neglect, anything that might explain the unfathomable. But no one truly understood Lily. No one truly saw her for what she was: a frightened, confused little girl who had unwittingly caused something terrible and now lived in the shadow of her own actions. The constant evaluations, the endless questioning, the focus on her guilt, it wore her down. She began to withdraw even further, no longer responding to the doctors or teachers, her gaze distant and hollow. The weight of the tragedy had settled inside her like a dark cloud, and no one had the answers to lift it. At home, the emotional consequences for Lily were no less overwhelming. Her parents, once loving and supportive, found themselves at odds with one another in the face of the tragedy. Her mother, who had been devastated by the loss of her child's innocence, struggled to understand how to help Lily navigate the storm of emotions that seemed to consume her. Her father, ever stoic, withdrew into his own grief, unable to comfort his daughter in the way she needed. They both blamed themselves, each in their own way. Her mother questioned whether she had been too strict, too distant. Her father wondered if he had failed to notice signs of something deeper, something darker, in Lily's behavior. But the truth was, there was no one to blame. Not really. The daycare's closure meant that Lily's world, once filled with structure and routine, was now an open field of confusion. She no longer had the comforting structure of the daycare to hold her together, no familiar faces to guide her through her days. Instead, she was confined to the home, her movements monitored, her every action scrutinized by her parents and by the professionals who had been sent to evaluate her. She couldn't escape the trauma, couldn't hide from the fact that everything around her seemed to be falling apart. The outside world saw her as the instigator of a tragedy, but in her own eyes, she was just a small child lost in a whirlwind of confusion. As the months wore on, Lily's emotional state deteriorated further. She began to speak less, retreating even more into her world of quiet isolation. Her parents had tried to enroll her in a new daycare, hoping to offer some semblance of normalcy, but Lily refused to go. The thought of being in another daycare, in another place that could somehow turn into a nightmare, was too much for her to bear. She clung to her parents more and more, refusing to let them out of her sight, as if afraid that the world might collapse again without their protection. But the damage had already been done. The weight of the tragedy, the legal battles, the constant psychological probing, had taken something from Lily that she would never regain. The community around her was fractured as well. The parents of the other children, those whose lives had been lost in the tragedy, mourned in their own ways. But there was no solace in their grief, no resolution. The legal battles dragged on, and the daycare's owners, along with the teachers, faced years of litigation. As for Lily, she became a symbol, both a victim and a perpetrator in the eyes of the public. People who had once admired her innocence now viewed her with suspicion, as though she had carried a darkness inside her all along. She became the focal point for a tragedy that could never be undone. A living reminder of the fragility of life and the unpredictable consequences of even the smallest actions. As the years passed, Lily's parents continued to try to make sense of what had happened. They held on to the hope that their daughter might one day find peace, that the weight of the tragedy might eventually lift from her small shoulders. But deep down, they knew that no amount of time would ever erase the scars, emotional, legal, or otherwise, that had been etched into their lives and into Lily's forever. The nightmare had become their reality, and they, like Lily, were left to navigate a world that would never be the same. The months following the tragic incident at the daycare passed with an eerie sense of unrelenting silence. The news cycle, once obsessed with the story of a 3-year-old girl caught at the center of a horrifying tragedy, had begun to move on, as news stories do. But for Lily and her parents, the weight of that day's events would never leave. It had seeped into every corner of their lives, an unspoken presence that shaped their every action, every interaction. The world outside had largely forgotten, or at least moved past the incident, but within the confines of their home, nothing was the same. Lily, the little girl who had once been so full of life and wonder, was now a mere shadow of her former self. The sparkle in her eyes, once brimming with the innocence of childhood, had dulled. She was no longer the child who loved to run through the yard, to swing on the swings, to chase the butterflies in the spring air. Instead, she spent her days in silence, often staring out the window, as if waiting for something, perhaps waiting for the world to make sense again, or waiting for it all to end. She would not go outside to play with the other children in the neighborhood, even though they called for her. She refused to join them in their games, her small frame always huddled behind the safety of the curtains or beneath the covers of her bed. Her once enthusiastic voice was now reduced to a whisper, the words she spoke few and far between, often laced with fear and confusion. Her parents, devastated by the tragedy, found themselves trapped in a kind of emotional limbo. They had never expected their child to be at the center of something so horrifying, and neither of them knew how to react. Her mother, Sarah, had been the first to fall into a deep depression. She spent countless hours poring over Lily's drawings, her journals, trying to find some clue, some sign that her daughter had been troubled long before the accident. Sarah had become obsessed with finding the cause, the reason why Lily had acted in such an unthinkable way. She felt guilty, convinced that there had been something she had missed, some change in Lily's behavior, some subtle warning sign that had gone unnoticed. But no matter how much she searched, no matter how many nights she spent wondering where she had gone wrong, the answer remained elusive. The feeling of guilt gnawed at her, unrelenting, as if she too had been complicit in the tragedy. How could a mother not protect her child? How could she not know what was happening inside her own home? Lily's father, Mark, took a different approach. His stoic exterior remained intact, but inside he was unraveling. He was a man who had built his life on control, on the idea that, with enough discipline and hard work, he could shape his future and his family's future. But now, with the weight of this tragedy pressing down on him, he felt utterly helpless. Nothing had prepared him for this. He had tried to be the strong one, the one who would provide for his family, who would keep them safe from the dangers of the world. And yet, here he was, unable to protect his daughter from the unseen force that had descended upon their lives. He became obsessed with trying to fix Lily, trying to find ways to bring her back to the child she once was. He enrolled her in therapy, forced her into social interactions with other children, and even attempted to take her on small family outings, hoping that somehow something would spark within her. But Lily was beyond reach. She was locked inside herself, trapped by the invisible walls of her own mind. The psychological toll on Lily was immense. The constant evaluations, the repeated probing by therapists and psychologists only deepened her sense of isolation. The professionals who came to assess her seemed more interested in finding a label, a diagnosis, than actually understanding her. They spoke of trauma, of PTSD, of the profound effects of witnessing a tragic event at such a young age. But Lily didn't understand the words they used. She didn't know what PTSD was, or why she felt so disconnected from the world around her. All she knew was that something terrible had happened, something that she could not explain or undo. She felt as though she had been torn apart, her sense of self shattered into 1,000 tiny pieces that she couldn't put back together. Her parents watched helplessly as their once vibrant daughter continued to wither away, consumed by the aftermath of an event she had never intended to cause. They had hoped that time would heal the wounds, that eventually Lily would be able to return to the child she once was. But as the years passed, it became clear that the scars of that day would never fade. The incident had left an indelible mark on her, a deep wound that would never fully heal. At school, Lily was treated differently. The other children, initially curious, quickly lost interest in her. They whispered behind her back, unsure of what had happened or why Lily was so different now. Some of the teachers were kind, trying to help her reintegrate into the classroom, but the damage had been done. The other kids were scared, not just of her, but of the tragedy that had defined her life. They didn't know how to interact with a child who had been at the center of such a horrific event. Lily, for her part, tried to remain invisible. She would sit at the back of the classroom, drawing or staring out the window, her mind drifting far away from the world of lessons and homework. She had no friends, no connection to the other children. The other kids learned to ignore her, and Lily learned to retreat even further into her isolation. The long-term effects on Lily's emotional state were undeniable. She had nightmares, vivid and terrifying, often waking up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, screaming for someone to save her. Her dreams were filled with images of the daycare, of the blocks falling, of the terrified faces of the other children. In these dreams, she would always try to run, to stop the disaster from happening, but she was always too late. The fear of being responsible, of having caused something that could never be undone, haunted her waking hours as well. She had no sense of normalcy, no sense of security. Every day was a struggle, a constant reminder of the pain she had inflicted, even if she had not understood it at the time. Her relationship with her parents grew strained. Though they loved her, their inability to help her, their inability to fix the damage that had been done, created a distance between them that they could not bridge. They tried, in their own ways, to offer comfort, but their efforts often fell flat. Sarah, in particular, struggled with her inability to protect Lily from the trauma. Mark, meanwhile, felt guilty for not being able to shield his family from the horror of the event. They both carried a deep sorrow, an unspoken grief that hung over their household like a dark cloud. Their home, once a place of warmth and laughter, had become a place of tension and quiet suffering. The emotional toll on Lily continued into her adolescence. She never quite fit in with the other children at school, always feeling like an outsider. Her peers, having long since moved on from the incident, treated her with indifference or curiosity, but never with empathy. She was a living reminder of something unspeakable, a tragedy that no one knew how to process. She did her best to push the memories aside, to bury the feelings of guilt and sorrow deep within her, but it was impossible to escape them. She carried the weight of that day on her shoulders, a burden she would never be able to shed. As an adult, Lily would look back on her childhood with a sense of detached sorrow. She would come to understand that she had been forever changed by the tragedy, that the events of that fateful day had defined the trajectory of her life in ways she could never have predicted. The psychological scars, the emotional wounds would never heal completely. The guilt, though less immediate, would linger, festering in the quiet corners of her mind. The child who had once been so full of life would remain trapped in the haunting memories of the past, a prisoner of her own history. The community, too, was irrevocably altered. The daycare's closure left a void, a reminder of the fragility of life and the darkness that can sometimes creep into even the most innocent of settings. The families affected by the tragedy carried their own burdens, their own scars, each one marked by the event in different ways. And though time had passed, the echoes of that day still reverberated in the lives of those who had been touched by it. In the end, there was no simple resolution, no way to undo what had been done. The tragedy at the daycare was a reminder of the randomness of fate, of how the smallest of actions can have the most catastrophic of consequences. For Lily, it was a lesson she would carry with her for the rest of her life. And for her parents, the knowledge that their child had been caught in the middle of such a devastating event would haunt them forever. The aftermath of the tragedy was not something that could be measured in days or years. It was a weight that would last a lifetime.